Good morning and welcome to Church at Home with Rachael for Thursday, the 15th of December, 10 days until Christmas Day. My name is Rachael Parker. My pronouns are she and her, and I am an Anglican priest, the rector or priest in charge of Dayspring Ministries, which is a collaboration of cooperating parishes, St. Mary's in Edgerton, St. Thomas and Wainwright St. Saviour's in Vermilion, in the Anglican Diocese of Edmonton in the Anglican Church of Canada, located in Alberta, Canada. So I'm glad to see you today. A couple of weeks ago, somebody made a comment on one of my videos talking about original sin, and I said I would try to tackle that. And I've been thinking a lot about that. I confess, my bailiwick as a priest is not theology. If you haven't guessed that yet, I don't spend my time with my nose in books, and I'm not. I can think. I'm a not unintelligent priest, but my thing is not reading textbooks. And I grew up in a church environment in mostly small town churches where my priest wasn't, standing up in the pulpit talking about theology, doctrine, and dogma. He was talking about life and Jesus and how we live together and how we live out our Christian promises, our baptismal promises. And that really had an impact on who I am as a priest. So while I enjoy reading things like that, I'm also not a speed reader. And I love to read lots of things. So I tend not to dive into tomes of theology. And so I don't know with any certainty that I could talk to you about original sin and things like that. But I can talk to you about the things I think about. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. I've been reading a book that talks about being victims of grace, when God's grace breaks in upon us. And it sounds kind of awful, but it's a beautiful theological understanding that I am only beginning to sort of be able to live out in my life. So eventually I'll have more to say about that. I mentioned it last week in one of my videos. But part of it, the author was talking about Adam and Eve in the garden. And I mean, I've read the Genesis passages so often. In case you're not aware, there are two different creation stories that if you're theologically bent to be a literalist, that can be a difficult thing to look at. So if you want to, look up Genesis 1 to chapter 2, verse 3, and then take a look at chapters 2, verse 4 through chapter 3. They're two very different stories about creation, about how we all came into being. And you can ask me questions and you can debate with me all you want if you like. We can talk about that another day. But so I've been thinking about the part of creation story where God is in the garden with Adam and Eve. This idea of God walking with them and talking with them. Then Adam and Eve, like Eve is tempted by the snake and she eats the apple, convinces Adam to eat the apple, and all of a sudden they realize they're naked and they don't want to be seen. And so when God comes wandering through the garden to chat with them in the evening, they're hiding themselves. And I got thinking about for me, what is the sin? What is that thing that happened? I don't want to get into the whole fact of the snake and the apple or the pomegranate or whatever piece of fruit it was and the forbidden fruit, all this stuff. It's more about this idea that once upon a time, Adam and Eve had such an open and trusting relationship with God that they could just simply be with God exactly as they were, naked, whatever that meant. I mean, we all have this idea of what naked means, right? That's not what I think. Maybe we're taking it a little bit too literally. But thinking about Adam and Eve, sort of, day one through day whatever years, however long they were together with God, sitting around talking, maybe have a fire, chatting, eating the fruits of the garden, talking about the day, what's God's plans for tomorrow, things like that. And how that open, honesty, easy relationship they have with each other. And then something happened, and now they feel shame. They are aware that they're naked, that they feel uncovered, they feel exposed, they feel vulnerable, and they feel uncomfortable with God seeing them that way. Which makes me wonder if the greatest sin here we're talking about is really the sin of mistrust. God did not change. The God who sat with them when they were naked, all those times before, who had conversations, who loved them for exactly who they were as they were created, hasn't changed. God hasn't changed at all. And then we look at Adam and Eve. Have they changed? Essentially, they have not. They are still exactly the way they were when God made them, and God said that this is very good. They hadn't changed. They were physically the way they were mentally, emotionally the way where they were. The only thing that changed was their sense of themselves. God didn't change. Their sense of who they were changed. They all of a sudden looked at themselves and said, oh dear, we're naked. We're not good enough. We've done something wrong. We've positioned ourselves in a way that God won't like. We can't show ourselves to God. Did God say that? No. God did not say, you aren't good enough. God didn't say to them, you're naked. You can't be near me when you're naked. God, as a matter of fact, God looked at them and saw how ashamed they were feeling about their nakedness, and God gave them clothing. God gave them something to allow them to not feel as ashamed. They no longer trusted God. They no longer trusted that the love God had for them all along was strong enough to love them even though they felt they weren't worthy. They felt they weren't worthy. Therefore, God couldn't think they were worthy. It's a big change, isn't it? But the change was in the people, not in God. Sometimes I wonder if that's the problem that we have, is that we are so heavily judgmental of ourselves that we impose our judgment on God. That we say, if I look in the mirror and see someone whose hair is too frizzy or who's too big or who has, a gap in her tooth, then I am not worthy. I am not good enough. I do not match the standard of society that the world has, so I'm not good enough. Then God can't possibly love me. If I can't love me, then God couldn't love me. And we've got, that's so bass-ackward. That is so wrong. The truth is that God never said to us, I no longer love you. God never said to us, you need to be ashamed of yourselves. God never said to us, you can't trust me. But God also never said, I can't trust you. God, I don't think God condemned Adam and Eve out of the garden because God said, you've done wrong. I think that he didn't condemn them at all. I think Adam and Eve kicked themselves out of the garden because they said, we can't be trusted. We can't possibly be worth redeeming. We can't possibly be worthy of God's love. And I think it must have broken God's heart for them to make that decision, to make that choice. And I believe that God has spent all of creation since then trying to help us recognize that that was our decision and not God's. Hence Jesus. God gave us part of himself in Jesus to say, I love you. And since you can't get that through your heads, you feel like there needs to be some kind of a moment of redeeming, then I'll give it to you. Here you go. Here's my gift of redemption. I give you my son, part of myself. Okay, now can we be in relationship again? And somehow we still hold back and say, no, God, even your gift isn't good enough for us. We are that unworthy. When the reality is we need to shake our heads and recognize that whether we believe we are worthy or not, God has said we are. We are God's children and we are worthy exactly as we are, even if we are physically not what we think we should be, even if we are mentally not what we think we should be, even if we are spiritually feel like we are drowning, God says to us, that does not matter. I love you for exactly who you are. Now we need to do the work of helping you love you for exactly who you are. So there's my thoughts on what happened in the Garden of Eden. I don't think it was original sin. I think it was original mistrust, an original mistake. But I could be wrong, and God could be laughing. God's self off his high chair in heaven because I've so mistakenly understood all this. But the truth is, that's where I'm at. That's what I'm thinking. What do you think? What are your thoughts? How do you feel about the idea that maybe you are loved for exactly who you are? And the difficulty is that you don't love yourself yet. God loves you, and so do I, for exactly who you are. Have a good day. God bless you, and I will see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachael.